What should just be a peaceful ride to summer camp turns into a nightmare for a group of students. When the school bus veers off course, something sinister awaits in the darkness of the forest. The driver knows more than he's letting on, and the students soon discover that not everyone will return home. Welcome to the channel where every ride could be your last. Here, we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories of drivers and passengers who have faced the unexplainable on the roads. If you like feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe now. Hit the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next race could be yours. The trip to the camp. It was the beginning of summer, and the warm air brought a sense of freedom to the students who were about to embark on a trip to summer camp. The old yellow school bus waited in the school parking lot, its engine rumbling gently, ready to take the group of students to a destination that, for many, seemed like an unforgettable adventure. But no one imagined what was coming. Last call. All aboard, shouted the driver, a middle-aged man named Walter, in a hoarse, tired voice. He wore a faded cap, and his face was marked by time, with eyes that seemed to observe everything around them in a penetrating way. His calm posture hid something that the lively and carefree students didn't realize. Lucas, one of the leaders of the student group, got on the bus first, followed by his friends. He was a confident kid with an easy smile and a laid-back attitude. Next to him was Emily, his best friend since childhood, who was more reserved but always present in important moments. Mike, the joker of the group, followed closely behind, and finally, Sophie, a curious and lively girl, who loved exploring new places and counted the minutes until she got to camp. Let's do it. Camp, here we come, shouted Mike, causing laughter among his colleagues. The other students also got comfortable, occupying the bus seats while the driver silently closed the doors and began the journey. The sky was clear, and the drive along the winding road, surrounded by forests and hills, seemed peaceful. The music in the background and the laughter of the students created a relaxed atmosphere. However, as soon as the bus left the more populated areas and began to enter dirt roads, something in the atmosphere changed. The students' laughter and chatter gradually subsided, and a feeling of isolation began to set in. The forest surrounding the road seemed thicker, and the once bright sun began to disappear behind the trees, casting long shadows across the road. Emily, sitting next to Lucas, looked out the window and frowned. "Are we on the right path?" "I thought the camp was closer," he commented, his voice filled with slight concern. "Relax, Em," Lucas replied with a confident smile. "We're probably taking a shortcut." Emily tried to relax, but something inside her didn't feel right. There was something strange about the way the driver, Walter, stared at the road. He hadn't said a word since they left school, and his rigid stance behind the wheel seemed out of character. As the bus advanced, the dirt road became increasingly narrow and bumpy. The surrounding trees were closer, as if the forest was closing in on them. The air inside the bus was thicker, and the conversation between the students had almost completely ceased. Suddenly, the bus made a sharp turn, and Walter stopped abruptly. "What is happening?" Mike asked, standing up to look out the window. Outside, an almost imperceptible path, covered in branches and leaves, seemed to lead into the heart of the forest. "This isn't the way to camp," muttered Emily, her heart racing now. Walter, however, remained calm and began to drive along the narrow path. The sound of tires crunching dry leaves echoed through the silent forest, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. Lucas's relaxed smile disappeared, and he looked at Emily with a doubtful expression. "Okay, This is weird, Lucas said, leaning forward in the seat to try and talk to the driver. Hey, Walter, are you sure we're going to camp? Walter didn't respond. He just continued driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as the surrounding environment became more and more oppressive. Sophie, who was sitting in the back seat, noticed that the other students' behavior was changing. The relaxed atmosphere had disappeared, and now there was an uncomfortable silence. Why are we straying from the path? Is this some kind of joke? She asked aloud, but no one responded. Finally, Lucas decided to get up and went to the front of the bus. Hey, Walter, where are we going? You know this isn't the right way, right? Walter briefly glanced at Lucas in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and emotionless, and finally broke the silence with a low, harsh voice. I'm taking you to a special place. The words fell like a stone in Lucas's stomach. What do you mean by that? He asked, now with a growing sense of danger. What is happening? Before he could get an answer, the bus came to a complete stop in the middle of the forest. The surrounding trees felt suffocating, and a fine mist began to form between the trunks, obscuring the view of what lay beyond. The silence outside was deafening. Walter slowly stood up, and the students stared at him in a mix of confusion and fear. We turned off the main road for a reason, he said, looking directly at Lucas, as if waiting for a reaction. This place has something in store for all of you. What the hell does that mean? Shouted Mike, his voice echoing through the forest. The nervousness in his voice infected the other students, who were now completely on alert. He's joking, right? Sophie tried to say, but her voice was shaking. Walter opened the bus door and got out, leaving the students alone for a moment. What was supposed to be a peaceful trip to summer camp now turned into a terrifying situation. No one knew what was going on, but Walter's strange behavior and the ominous atmosphere of the forest left no doubt that something was very wrong. We have to get out of here, Emily murmured, grabbing Lucas' arm. We can't sit here and wait to find out what he wants. Lucas looked around, trying to quickly think of a solution. But the dense forest around the bus seemed like an endless maze, and the feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. He knew something was about to happen, something that would change their lives forever. Walter reappeared at the bus entrance, holding an axe in his hands. The moment Walter appeared at the entrance of the bus holding the axe made time stop. The cold glow of the blade reflected the few remaining lights in the sky, and the hearts of every student inside the bus seemed to beat in unison, accelerated by the rising panic. What are you doing with this? Lucas asked, trying to remain calm, but his voice wavered. Walter took a slow step into the bus, the axe firmly in his hands. His gaze, cold and fixed, swept over the students' faces one by one, as he said, in a low, threatening tone, "You're not going anywhere. Is this some kind of joke?" Mike shouted, his usual bravado masking the terror that filled him. He got up from his seat, but Emily pulled his arm tightly. "Be quiet, Mike. He's not kidding." Emily whispered urgently, her eyes wide, locked on Walter's menacing figure. Walter approached closer, stopping in the middle of the corridor, blocking the exit. "You were brought here for a reason. This forest is hungry. And I am what feeds." The words came out of his mouth like poison, each syllable filling the space with a deadly threat. The axe seemed to gain weight in everyone's mind, becoming a symbol of imminent danger. The students were trapped. The bus exit was blocked, and the surrounding forest seemed to swallow up any hope of escape. Sophie, sitting in the back of the bus, felt her heart hammer against her chest. She looked around frantically, looking for a way out, anything that might help. "We have to get out of here," she whispered to herself, feeling the adrenaline rush through her veins. Lucas, who was closest to Walter, knew he needed to act quickly. "Walter, what are you doing? Why are you doing this?" He tried to argue, remaining calm, hoping that he could somehow reach what was left of reason in the driver. "I said this place has something in store for you," Walter repeated, almost with disturbing calm. "You're not the first, and you certainly won't be the last." Lucas looked back at his friends. The tension in the air was palpable, and he knew that if he didn't do something quickly, the situation would worsen in a matter of seconds. He motioned with his eyes to Emily, trying to communicate without words. Emily understood immediately. They needed to get off that bus, and they needed to do it now. "Emily," Lucas whispered as Walter was momentarily distracted by Mike, who was still trying to control his panic. "When I give the signal, run. Don't look back." Emily nodded, her breathing quick but focused. She knew Lucas's plan was risky, but it was their only chance of escaping with their lives. Then, without warning, Lucas advanced. He pushed Mike aside and lunged at Walter, grabbing the axe by the shaft with both hands. Surprise took over Walter for a brief moment, long enough for Lucas to try to disarm him. "Now!" Lucas shouted as he fought the driver. Emily wasted no time. She grabbed Sophie by the hand and ran toward the emergency exit at the back of the bus. "Come on. We have to leave," shouted Emily, her voice cutting through the chaos, taking over the bus. Sophie, still in shock, followed Emily without hesitation. They ran to the emergency exit, with Emily slamming the lever to open the door. The sound of cold forest wind entered the bus as soon as the door opened. Meanwhile, the fight between Lucas and Walter intensified. Walter, stronger than he looked, pushed Lucas hard, throwing him against the bus aisle. The axe fell to the ground with a metallic clang, but Walter didn't hesitate to pick it up again. "You can't run away," he roared as he raised his axe, ready to attack. Lucas, still dizzy from the fall, crawled back, trying to gain distance from Walter. Mike, who until now had been paralyzed by fear, finally reacted. "You will not touch him," Mike shouted, throwing himself at Walter, trying to hold him back. The fight was brief. Walter, with inhuman strength, knocked Mike down with a direct blow to the chest, leaving him on the ground, panting. The horror in Lucas' eyes was evident. He knew Mike was seriously injured, but there was no time to grieve. Emily and Sophie were already off the bus, running through the dark forest. Lucas, still crawling, looked at the open emergency exit. He knew this was his only chance. Walter, now with blood in his eyes, raised the axe again, ready to finish the job with Lucas. But Lucas, with one last burst of adrenaline, kicked the axe out of Walter's hands and ran toward the exit. He jumped through the emergency door, feeling the cold forest air wash over his body. The darkness was oppressive, but he didn't stop. Lucas ran as fast as he could, the sound of branches breaking beneath his feet echoing through the forest. "Emily! Sophie!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with exertion. But the forest seemed to absorb their voice, as if it were swallowing them. The girls were ahead, running without stopping. Emily's heart was beating so fast that she could barely hear her own thoughts. She didn't know where they were going. The forest was an endless maze. The trees, tall and imposing, blocked any clear view of the sky. The path became increasingly confusing, and every sound in the forest seemed to echo, as if something was chasing them. "Where's Lucas?" Sophie asked, panting, looking back as they ran. "He'll find us," Emily replied, her voice cracking with effort. "He has to find us." But the darkness around them was beginning to take shape. Shapes of shadows that moved between the trees, distant figures that seemed to follow them silently, like predators waiting for the right moment to attack. Lucas, now alone in the forest, ran frantically, trying to find the girl's path. The sound of Mike's screams still echoed in his mind, but he knew he couldn't go back. If he returned, everyone would be doomed. The only thing he could do was try to survive, and try to save his friends. The forest seemed to go on for miles, and the night was getting colder. The silence was disturbing. There was no sound of animals, just the wind through the leaves and Lucas's quick steps crunching the ground. Suddenly he heard it. Quick footsteps coming from behind. He stopped, panting, and looked around. The sound of footsteps seemed to increase, and his mind began to spin. Was Walter following them? Or could it be something more? Something that the forest itself hid? Fear set in. Lucas knew that the fight for survival was just beginning. Walter wasn't the only threat in those woods. Something else was lurking, something ancient, hungry, and even more dangerous. "I need to find them," Lucas whispered to himself, forcing himself to keep running. The darkness was overwhelming, and he knew every second counted. But what he didn't know was that night, not everyone would escape the forest. Lucas continued running through the forest, his feet tripping over the branches and roots that littered the leaf-covered ground. The air was thick, and darkness enveloped him like a suffocating cloak. He tried to get his bearings, looking for some sound, some sign of Emily and Sophie, but all he heard was the echo of his own footsteps and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Emily! Sophie!" he screamed, his voice disappearing into the vastness of the forest. The feeling of isolation was beginning to set in, and fear was seeping deep into his mind. The forest felt different now, alive, as if it were watching your movements. Then, in the middle of the oppressive silence, a noise. Steps. But not his. Lucas stopped abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked back, eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. He knew he wasn't alone. The footsteps were soft, almost imperceptible, but there was something or someone approaching. "Walter!" Lucas whispered to himself, dread taking over. But the idea that Walter was following him didn't make sense. The driver had been left behind, injured, or so he hoped. But what if it was something more? Something the forest itself was hiding? A louder crack interrupted his thoughts, and Lucas wasted no time. He threw himself forward again, running as he had never run before. His legs hurt, but adrenaline drove him forward. He needed to find Emily and Sophie. "I needed to get out of that forest." As he ran, the trees seemed to get even closer, their branches bending like arms that tried to grab him. Every shadow he saw around him seemed more real, more threatening. Lucas knew the forest was playing with his mind. But there was something far more dangerous than the shadows, the sounds that followed him. Finally, after minutes that seemed like hours, he saw something up ahead. Dim lights shone amidst the darkness. He moved closer, realizing it was Emily and Sophie, who had found a small clearing where moonlight could filter through the trees. "Luke!" Emily screamed when she saw him. The relief in his voice was clear, but it also carried a tone of urgency. "What's going on? Is he following us?" Lucas, still panting, tried to calm down enough to speak. I don't know. I thought he was, but there's something else here, Emily. Something in the forest. We need to get out of here now." Sophie, eyes wide, looked around as if she was seeing things that weren't there. "I feel like something is watching us," she said, her voice shaky. "It's not just Walter, this forest is wrong." Lucas approached the two, trying to calm them down, although he himself was terrified. "We have to keep going. If we stay here, he'll find us." "What if he's already watching us?" Sophie asked, looking around, every noise in the forest like a ghostly whisper. Emily, more pragmatic, tried to maintain control. "Lucas is right. We can't stay still. We need to move and try to find the road again. If we keep running, maybe we can lose him." They were about to move forward when they heard a distinct sound that chilled everyone's blood. A scream. But it wasn't the cry of an animal, nor of an ordinary person. It was a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Something evil that sent shivers down my spine. "What was that?" Sophie asked, almost crying. "This can't be real." Lucas tried to rationalize, but even he knew the sound didn't belong to anything he knew. Maybe it's an animal. "We need to keep moving." But before they could take the first step, a larger shadow appeared in front of them. It was tall, shapeless, and seemed to move with frightening fluidity. It wasn't Walter, Lucas was sure of that. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. Emily took a step back, her breath hitching, while Lucas and Sophie remained frozen in fear. The figure moved slowly towards them, as if it was analyzing them, waiting for the right moment to attack. Suddenly, what sounded like Walter's voice echoed through the forest, even though he was nowhere in sight. "The forest chose you, as it chose others." The three backed away, panicked, realizing they weren't just dealing with a dangerous man. Something much older and more sinister was in control of the situation. The forest, or whatever was in it, seemed to have a life of its own, an evil force that held them in its grip. "Run!" Lucas shouted, without hesitation. They turned and ran through the forest, their feet crunching leaves and twigs on the ground as the sound of the creature followed them. Their breathing was heavy, and panic took over with every step. It was as if the forest itself was closing in around them, making it difficult for them to escape. "We have to find a road. Anything." Emily screamed, her voice breathless. But the trees seemed endless, and the feeling of being trapped in a nightmarish maze only increased. With each step, the creature got closer, and Lucas knew they were running out of time. Suddenly, Sophie tripped and fell, her body hitting the ground with a thud. "Lucas! Emily!" "Wait!" she screamed, struggling to get up. Lucas and Emily stopped immediately, running back to help Sophie. But as they got closer, they realized something was wrong. The roots around where Sophie fell seemed to be moving, as if they were alive. "Sophie, get up quickly!" Lucas shouted, pulling her by the arm. But the roots wrapped around her legs, pinning her to the ground. Sophie began to scream, desperate. "I can't get out. They're holding me back." Lucas and Emily tried to pull it with all their might, but the roots continued to tighten. "They are pulling me down," Sophie cried, her body being slowly pulled to the ground. "No," cried Emily, her hands clinging to Sophie's. "We won't leave you." But no matter how much they fought, the roots were winning. In desperation, Lucas looked around, but there was nothing he could use to free Sophie. Her screams echoed through the forest, and Lucas and Emily watched helplessly as Sophie was sucked into the earth, the roots tightening around her body until she disappeared completely, leaving only silence and darkness. Emily fell to her knees, crying, while Lucas, in shock, looked at the place where Sophie had disappeared. We couldn't save her," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Lucas felt despair take over. "The forest is alive. It is hunting us." They knew they couldn't stop. Not now. Sophie was lost, but they could still survive. They could still escape that damned forest. But as they ran again, hearts broken and dread rising, a frightening truth haunted them: the forest was hungry. And she wouldn't finish until they were all devoured. Emily was still kneeling on the ground, her hands shaking over the dirt where Sophie had been swallowed by the forest alive. His tears streamed down his face as his entire body seemed paralyzed with terror. Lucas, still in shock, forced himself to grab her shoulders and lift her up. "Emily, we have to go," Lucas whispered urgently, though his own voice shook with terror. He looked around, feeling the crushing weight of the forest closing in on them. "Sophie, she's gone," Emily murmured, pain and fear fighting to find space in her mind. But there was something beyond grief. The feeling that something bigger was lurking. Lucas knew there was no more time to hesitate. Every second spent in that forest seemed to fuel the darkness that surrounded them. "I know, I know." His voice was filled with desperation, but also determination. "But if we don't move now, we'll be next." He pulled her, forcing her to stand. With one last look at the place where Sophie had disappeared, they took off again through the forest, running as if their lives depended on it, and they did. The shadows seemed thicker, the sounds of the forest were like whispers that taunted them, and each step seemed to bring them closer to an invisible, deadly presence. As they ran, Lucas began to feel a strange pressure in his lungs, as if the air itself was becoming heavy. "This forest, it's trapping us," he thought, but didn't dare say it out loud to Emily. The sound of Walter's heavy footsteps became prominent again in the distance. He was still chasing them, but Lucas didn't know if he was the only threat. It was as if Walter was just an extension of the forest, a tool for something much older and more evil that was controlling everything. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, breathless, her eyes wide. "He's still coming. Walter is still behind us." "I know," Lucas replied, trying to remain calm. "But something else is here, Emily. It's not just him. We have to keep running." Suddenly, a clearing appeared ahead, a small open space surrounded by the same tall, menacing trees. Lucas and Emily stopped for a moment to catch their breath, their bodies sore and exhausted. The moonlight shone brightly over the clearing, creating a contrast to the darkness of the surrounding forest. Lucas turned to Emily, trying to find some kind of comfort in the clearing. "Maybe it'll be safer here, at least for a while." But before he could finish his sentence, a loud, metallic sound echoed through the forest. Walter's axe embedded itself in a nearby tree, and the sadistic driver appeared at the edge of the clearing. His breathing was heavy, and his gaze was fixed on them, full of fury and determination. "You can't run away from me," he said with a sickening smile. Emily cowered behind Lucas, terror in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" she screamed, her voice choked with pain and fear. Walter took a few steps towards them, his eyes reflecting the brightness of the moon, almost as if the forest was controlling him. "You don't understand. This forest isn't like the others. It's ancient. It's hungry. And I'm just the servant. The one who makes sure it gets what it needs. This is crazy," Lucas shouted. "You're killing people. You killed Sophie." "I didn't kill Sophie," Walter corrected, tilting his head almost casually. "The forest took her. She chooses." I'm just the guide. Lucas looked around desperately, trying to find an escape route. Emily, run. Run now, he shouted. But before they could move, the earth beneath their feet began to tremble slightly. The floor of the clearing seemed to vibrate, and roots began to emerge from the ground, twisting like living snakes, surrounding Lucas and Emily. The forest was alive, as if it had a mind of its own. Walter watched with satisfaction, without moving a muscle. She's already made her choice, he said coldly. She's going to take you. Lucas and Emily tried to move, but the roots quickly crept up their ankles, pinning them in place. The panic in Emily's eyes was unbearable. Lucas. I don't want to die here. Lucas, feeling his despair increasing, fought with all his strength against the roots. I won't let that happen, Emily. I promise. He looked at Walter, who remained motionless, watching everything with a disturbing look of satisfaction. You want to hand us over to this thing? Lucas shouted. Why? You could have chosen another life. Why be the servant of this curse? Walter laughed, a low, disturbing laugh. Do you think you can fight something as old as time? Something that has always been here? This forest was cursed long before any of us. I have simply accepted my role. I am the guardian, and you are just another sacrifice. Emily struggled against the roots, tears streaming down her face. Lucas, help me. I can't move. Lucas looked around desperately, looking for a solution. It was then that his eyes fell on Walter's axe, stuck in the tree next to him. The axe. He thought. Maybe it could be the key to his survival. With all his strength, Lucas threw himself forward, stretching his arm to the limit, his hands almost reaching the axe handle. Walter realized what he was trying to do and began to slowly advance. Do you think you can stop me? Walter said with a mischievous smile. The forest already got you, boy. But Lucas didn't give up. With one last effort, he grabbed the axe handle and pulled hard, ripping it from the tree. The roots around his legs tightened even more, but now he had a weapon. Walter took another step forward, but before he could react, Lucas raised the axe and swung it with all his strength, hitting one of the roots that trapped Emily. The root broke with a crack, and Emily managed to partially free herself. Go, Em. Run. Lucas shouted, swinging the axe again, this time towards the very roots that trapped him. Emily, still dazed, managed to free herself completely and began to run, but stopped when she saw Lucas still struggling against the roots that were trying to trap him again. Walter, enraged, advanced towards Lucas. You won't escape. But Lucas, now with the axe in hand, quickly turned and hit Walter in the chest with a powerful blow. Walter staggered back, the look of shock on his face replacing the cruel smile. The driver fell to his knees, blood dripping down his shirt, as he looked at Lucas one last time, his eyes darkening. The forest will get you either way. And then he fell, dead, to the ground in the clearing. Lucas, panting, dropped the axe to the ground and ran to Emily. The roots around them began to move again, but now more slowly, as if they were losing their strength. We have to get out of here, he said, pulling Emily by the hand. They ran across the clearing, the sound of roots and forest wind echoing behind them. But this time, there was something different. Walter's death seemed to have weakened the force that bound them. The path ahead was clearer, and the forest, although still alive, seemed to be losing its grip on them. Lucas and Emily ran until they couldn't run any longer, until finally, they saw a road ahead, lit by the first rays of morning. The nightmare was almost over. When they reached the road, they collapsed, exhausted but alive. The sound of birds echoed in the distance again, and the oppressive feeling of the forest began to disappear. "It's over," Emily whispered, still trying to process everything that had happened. "We did it." Lucas looked at her, his body sore and his mind exhausted, but with a small flame of relief lighting up in his chest. "Yes, we are done with." Lucas and Emily sat on the side of the road, exhausted, panting, and completely consumed by the relief of finally having escaped the forest. The first rays of the morning sun illuminated the path, and the sound of birds echoed softly again, almost as a sign that the nightmare was over. "We did it," Emily repeated, her voice weak and shaky. The weariness in their eyes reflected the terror they had faced, but relief was finally beginning to set in. Lucas looked at the dense forest behind them, now in the distance. It still looked imposing, the tall, shadowy trees swaying gently in the wind. There was something unsettling about that vision, as if the forest was still watching them, waiting for its next victim. "The forest, it was alive," he murmured, almost as if trying to convince himself that it was over. Emily shook her head slowly. "I've never seen anything like this. It was like a real nightmare. Walter, and all that. I can't believe we made it out." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the memories of Sophie's screams, the roots squeezing his ankles, and Walter's figure, cruel to the end. He was part of it. A servant of the forest, but he wasn't the real monster. His voice cracked a little as he said this. He knew that as much of a terrible threat as Walter had been, something deeper and older lived in those woods. The sound of a car approaching caught their attention. It was a small van that was traveling along the road, and when the driver saw them, he stopped abruptly. An older man, with a worried look on his face, got out of the vehicle. "My God, are you okay? What are you doing here in the middle of the road?" asked the man, visibly shocked to see the two young people covered in mud and with expressions of pure despair. Lucas and Emily looked at each other for a moment, not knowing exactly how to respond. How could they explain everything that happened? "The forest, Walter, Sophie. We need help," Emily finally said, her voice weak, while Lucas just nodded. The man opened the van door, offering a ride, and the two got into the vehicle. As they drove away from the forest, the man continued to cast worried glances at the two in the rearview mirror. "You were coming from summer camp, weren't you?" he asked, with a curious tone. Lucas and Emily were silent for a moment. "Yes," Lucas replied, the word coming out with difficulty. "But we can't get there." The man looked at them, his face now serious. "That forest. I've heard stories about that place. Bad things have happened there before." Emily looked out the window, seeing the trees behind. "So, we weren't the first?" The man shook his head, his face now grim. "No. Many have gotten lost in that forest. Some say it has a mind of its own, that it devours those who dare venture too deep. And there are rumors that a man, a driver, lives there, luring young people." Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. Walter, he was real. The man looked at them in the rearview mirror, and silence filled the van as they drove further and further into the forest. Weeks have passed since the incident, and Lucas and Emily have returned to their everyday lives, but nothing is the same as before. The memories of that night haunted them constantly, and the faces of Sophie and Mike, who never returned, were etched in their minds. They had survived, but they knew that something in the forest was still lurking, waiting for new victims. And every now and then, Lucas would wake up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, To the distant sound of moving roots and the echo of a familiar voice whispering, "The forest will always be hungry." It was clear to both of them that even if they had left the forest would never leave them. Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.